Hi, thanks so much for clicking on this video and diving into the world of the Wonder Women and Rebel Girls workshop. I'd like to quickly introduce myself. I'm Matilda Gregg and I'm the lead organiser on this event, supported by my wonderful colleagues at the War Through Other Stuff Society. I'm an early career historian based at University College Dublin with the support of the Irish Research Council. As you can see, this workshop is taking place entirely online, so the papers you're about to watch have all been pre-recorded over Zoom in the comfort of our speakers' homes in the last couple of months. I would like to particularly thank Mike at History Hub for his work in transforming Zoom meetings into the videos that you see before you today. There are 10 videos in total, covering topics from gender to sexuality to nationalism, propaganda, activism and exclusion. Together, they tell the complex story of how women warriors have been represented on screen, in print and in the news for the last few hundred years, and how things might or might not be changing. Now, without further ado, I'm truly honoured to hand over to our fabulous keynote speaker, Dr. Emma Butcher. Emma is a lecturer in literature and cultural heritage at Edge Hill University, who has published and written widely on histories of childhood. And the focus of our talk today is how girl writers, soldiers, and witnesses to war should fit into the picture. Thank you so much, Emma. I'm really looking forward to hearing your paper.
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you today, and I just wanted to say a huge thank you to the War Through Other Stuff conference organisers for this absolutely wonderful event, bringing together interdisciplinary war scholars around the globe, and also for inviting me to be the keynote for this event. It's an absolute honour, and I'm really pleased to be here today, even if it isn't the comfort of our own homes. You have to put up with me and my hamster today, but it's really lovely to be here and I'm very grateful. So without any further ado, here's my paper. It's titled War is an Ecstasy, Risk is Wild, Girls Writing War in the 19th Century. Charge on the enemy, victory leads. Capture their battery, footmen or cavalry. He shall be conqueror, fastest to speeds. Think not of danger now, enter the breach. Dream not of cannonball, mount by the shattered wall. Soon shall their banner staff bend to your reach. War is an ecstasy, risk is wild. What though their battlements stand like a rock? This poem is an exhilarating ride through the immediacy and adrenaline rush of battle. It captures the essence of war in its short, sharp bursts of awareness, almost modern or imagist in its deconstruction of language, down to the very bones of action. Reckless, think not of danger now, confident, charge on the enemy, powerful, soon shall their banner staff bend to your reach. Its lines, war is an ecstasy, risk is wild, are suggestive, playful, euphoric. Yet this is mixed with an underlying darker recognition of war's cost, with the author asking the soldier to put the cannonball mount by the shattered wall out of their mind. In short, this is a multifaceted and aware poem about the feelings and primality surrounding war. But who wrote this? Perhaps some soldier who had experienced the front line of battle? Well, no. It was written by a young woman with no experience of fighting in or witnessing war firsthand. This poem was written by none other than Charlotte Brontë. I will come back to the Brontë sisters, but what I seek to stress here is that girls' interest and involvement in war is continually surprising to us. Many think of Charlotte Brontë as a tackler of various social issues, be that class or gender injustices, but war, especially the act of battle, is not something we often align her or other historical women and girl writers with, bar some major exceptions, such as Anne Frank. The papers presented today show that all fluid categories of women engaged with war, from working class teenagers to queer nonconformists, and it is my aim today to add to this conversation, using familiar writers and new names from the archives to show the agency of girl writers, witnesses and fighters who contributed to war in the long 19th century. The first section of this talk will focus on the Napoleonic Wars, which is the main focus of my new research project. The material here is vast and rich and gives a strong demonstration of the varied types of interaction girlhood can have with war. In the second half of my paper, I move further into the 19th century, looking at two case studies of imperial conflicts, the Indian Uprising of 1857 to 58 and the Second Anglo-Afghan War from 1878 to 80. I'll address how marginalised girlhoods, both native and coloniser, engage with agency within these theatres of war. I want to start very briefly with my thoughts about girls' representations in war today. I grew up in the 1990s with some strong female leads as my childhood idols. I'm thinking of Disney's Mulan, the 16-year-old transgressive cross-dressing warrior, or Princess Mononoke, the Studio Ghibli film, with the 12-year-old militant wolf girl who rides into battle to save the spirit of the forest. These draw from a long global folklore tradition of women and children being a part of war, and they pave the way for youthful girl warriors to become globally franchised, like Rey in Star Wars or Arya Stark in Game of Thrones. Yet these girl heroes, most often on the side of the good guys, are still very much a fiction, an on-screen representation of physical strength meant to show little girls that they can be anything. The juxtaposition of girl warriors in fictional media versus real-life media is stark, as it should be, with the idea of youth in the midst of combat, real-life combat, an abhorrent and shocking phenomenon. Yet despite an overarching condemnation of youth being participants in global conflict, tabloids and social media are particularly suspicious of girls who are vocal about their experiences of war, and unlike our screen heroes, these are quickly silenced and villainised. For example, Bana Alabad, who amassed multiple thousands of followers when found tweeting from occupied Aleppo in 2016, she's a problematic example. Whereas some hailed her as a modern-day Anne Frank, doubts of Bana's authenticity began to filter into the global media. Her account was managed by her mother, Fatima, and many believed that Bana was being used as a political pawn either by her parents or to push the rebel agenda. Equally, Shamima Begum, the 15-year-old who left London to join the Islamic State, has also been stripped of her agency. Although this is a problematic situation, and many do still feel that her childhood actions equate to villainy, the inability for global governments to reconcile her status as both girl and terrorist has left her mute and abandoned in a Kurdish-run prison camp. There is no sense of heroism in these stories, just a sense of silencing, distrust, and uncanniness. Now, this is a good moment to segue into the main discussion of this lecture, which intends to show that no matter if girls are hero or villain, or neither, that their stories are worth listening to and considering as part of the military canon. Like Bana and Shamima today, girls were participants in war throughout the long 19th century, be that active fighters or writers, and their ephemera, even their presence, is a useful resource for providing new insights into various theatres of war. This talk intends to platform some of their marginalised voices, inviting you to consider that war girls are not just silent bystanders, but have history and a voice, and their stories and opinions should be incorporated into the military canon. I'll start with the Napoleonic Wars, with its stories of multiple women occupying the fields of battle. As Catherine Baker's paper touches upon, some dressed up as men, like Virginie Gacquet, who took her brother's place in the French army, or Joanna Zuber, who earned the highest accolade in the Polish military. Some women became national heroes, such as Augustina of Aragon, the Spanish Joan of Arc, who defended Zaragoza under a French siege, and some remain more obscure, like Jane Townsend, who fought in the Battle of Trafalgar and whose application for a Medal of Recognition was rejected, or perhaps the unknown bodies of women who were found in the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo. Amongst these, there are stories of particularly youthful women involved in fighting. A seamstress, Manuela Malasaña, who was 17 when she was caught up in the French occupation of Madrid. Legend has it that she was involved in fighting the French in defence of the artillery battery, but this could just be rumour. What is certain is that she was captured and executed for carrying scissors, viewed as a weapon, igniting an uprising in which she was mythologized as a hero of Madrid's recognition, a hero of Madrid's rejection of the French. Spain's ally, England, also produced a youthful woman fighter, William Brown. Brown was discovered to be a cross-dresser in 1815, the Times Annual Register running an article on how she was a commendable crew member of the HMS Queen Charlotte. In addition, Brown was a black woman, making her the first black woman to serve in the Royal Navy. At the time of her discovery, she was determined to be around 26 years of age, but the article states that she had been a seaman for 11 years, making her around 15 years old when she was a new recruit. The article commends her skill as a foretop, one of the most skilled jobs on the ship, to control the upper sails of the foremast. Now, to be recognised as this meant that she was one of the most capable sailors in the army. These women and girls show that, in a male-centred war, women were able to navigate various loopholes in an otherwise exclusionary system and become significant cogs in the war machine. Yet in these stories, we do not hear their voices. Their presence alone, though, is useful in reconfiguring women's place and role in war during the period. But it is actually the girls on the sidelines that provide some of the most detailed and insightful written accounts of the Napoleonic Wars, especially the darker, more problematic aspects of combat. Despite this being a conflict that was fought in mainland Europe, not touching mainland Britain, what was seen as the first total war sent shockwaves throughout the United Kingdom. There was mass demonstrations of patriotism, paranoia of invasion, and many had to witness the death toll, and also the physical and mental disability brought on the fighting male population. Here we now arrive again at the Brontës, who were born in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars between 1816 and 1819. Growing up, the siblings were surrounded by ex-militia men who worked the industrial factories, and the Brontës also read a numerous back catalogue of books and magazines in which the wars featured prominently. From this grounding, they created a fantasy saga based on the wars, written in tiny private books unintended for public consumption. Their sprawling kingdom was headed by various reinventions of the Duke of Wellington and Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous enemies that represented both Britain and France. This whole saga, which was written across the course of a decade, is a paper itself, but at a baseline level, it shows children engaging with battle strategies, wartime celebrity culture, nationalism, and politics. The poem I read at the beginning of this talk, Charge on the Enemy, demonstrates how much the siblings knew about war, engaging with not only factual events, but the feelings and sensations that went with combat. Yet it also goes deeper, showing that, despite not having lived through the wars, Charlotte had an intuitive understanding of the psychological effects of war. During and after the Napoleonic Wars, a number of memoirs were published by ex-soldiers, using their experiences to make money after they were put on half pay, which was often not enough to feed themselves and their families. For the first time, readers at home were given a personal insight into soldiers' encounters of battle, able to imagine what overseas conflict was like from the comfort of their armchairs. These memoirs were written in different styles, some travelogue, some even romance, but a number of them documented disturbing mental states soldiers experienced after battle. War trauma was still an unknown, ambiguous illness in the 19th century, open to a bewildering array of labels and diagnoses, such as nostalgia, combining nostos, the Greek nostos, which means home, and algos, which means pain or ache. And also another one was cannonball wind, where literally people thought you caught fright from a passing cannonball. Yet, present in these memoirs were troubling passages that emphasised war's effects on the individual suffering soldier. The military memoirs the Brontës read, most notably Tales of Field and Flood by John Malcolm and The Subaltern by George Gleig, provide strong allusions to war trauma. In Tales of Field and Flood, Malcolm laments of his psychological wounds, exclaiming that he can find no respite from the pains of memory but in slumbers of the night, when, in the land of shadows and of dreams, they meet with the distant and the dead. In an earlier section of the memoir, Malcolm experiences vivid hallucinations in the catacombs of Paris whilst briefly touring the capital after a battle in 1814. He writes, "A cold perspiration broke over my whole body. I stood fixed to the spot in a trance of horror and despair. 1,000 hideous forms of darkness seemed to flit past me. The skulls with their eyeless sockets seemed to scowl upon me. My head became dizzy. The vaults with their skeleton pillars spun me in the dance of death. My brain reeled, and I fell against a crashing pile of mortality, where I swooned away." George Gleig also recounts a similarly horrifying experience in The Subaltern. After discovering a watchman in a swoon, the narrator takes him back to a safe house, where he recounts how he saw a troop of devils dancing beside the water's edge and a creature in white groaning heavily. He then swears that a dead man sat up and stared at him in the face. This sense of delusion, depression, and anxiety spill into the Brontë siblings' collaborative writings. In an early battle, the saga's soldier author, John Flower, reports how his fatigue, combined with bodily and mental irritation and weakness, reduced him to a temporary delusion. After the war, he locked himself away, feeling harassed, reliving the experience of man dashed on man in trampled blood. In another story, the post-battle manner of an upper-class soldier is described to be cold and distant, and an ex-soldier writes, "When the battle was over and the victory was won, I have frequently felt much depressed in spirits." Mental suffering also defines Charlotte's most insightful piece of war writing. I feel it is. It's titled He Could Not Sleep, The Couch of War, which she wrote in 1837. Written after a recent bloody civil war, the poem shows the mourner, her Wellington-like king, to be plagued with sleeplessness and a troubled mind. It goes, "He could not sleep. His temples pressed to the hard pillow throbbed with pain, the belt around his noble breast his heart's wild pulse could scarce restrain, and stretched in feverish unrest, awake the great commander lay. The sods of battle round him welter, in noble blood that morning shed, and gorged with prey and now declining from all the fire of glory won, watchful and fierce he lies repining over what may never be undone." The traumatic implications of the verse are evident. The uncontrollable, contorted body at war with mundane reality. His belt, a supposed symbolic object of heroism, loops round him in a restrictive cycle that intensifies the conflict between objective military performativity and true bodily and spiritual suffering. The sensational hyperbolic language emphasizes the confusing and tormenting nature of recalling the battle, welter. The form and structure of the poem emphasize the mourner's disquiet. It is cyclical, the rhyming pattern bringing tight closure while the content runs on in a form of fractured enjambment as the wounds are reopened anew. Single words create paradoxical tensions within themselves. For example, the present participle verb, repining, indicates a form of physical stillness and contradicts the mourner's active, fraught mind, which is in itself a form of battlefield. The final line that laments over what may never be undone consolidates the traumatic structure of the poem. The need to repeat becomes compulsive, and involuntary. In short, there is much language in this verse that implies Charlotte's nuanced recognition and understanding of the mental effects of war. Even though she had no first experience of conflict, she has accurately captured and reflected on the sentiments and feelings of adults around her. In her girlhood, she was able to recognise and negotiate the language of trauma in an age where technically the phenomenon did not exist. Yet Charlotte is not the only well-known 19th century writer to understand feelings of suffering. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the celebrated poet and campaigner for multiple social injustices, including slavery and child labour, emotionally connected with the toll of war at an early age. Her first poem, On the Cruelty of Forcement to Man, written when she was just 6 years old in 1812, concerned the Navy's practice of conscripting men from civilian life on the pretext they were deserters. It goes, "Are the poor lad in yonder boat, forced from his wife, his friends, his home? Now, gentle maiden, how can you look at the misery of his doom?" This pacifist stance merged with a recognition of deep grief, as to Charlotte's convincing portrait that children were engaged and active in wartime culture, concerned with historical wars and present military events of the day and their impact on everyday life. Browning, at only 6 years of age, was able to recognise suffering and injustice, able to convey her realisation of war and its horrors into a political statement. This epiphanic response to war spanned the country. In Scotland, another young writing protégé was documenting her experiences of the Napoleonic Wars. Marjorie Fleming, known to her admirers as Pet Marjorie, actually lived throughout the wars, born in 1803 and dying aged just 8 years old in 1811. In fact, Britain at war was all she ever knew. During her short life, she kept an extraordinary diary, couldn't even get the word out then, extraordinary diary on life as a child living in Scotland. She also wrote poetry, which was appreciated by both Sir Walter Scott and Robert Louis Stevenson. In her writings, she makes frank observations about the current overseas conflicts, their ongoing presence offering moments of realization throughout her narrative. At age 7, in one stirring passage, she remarks, "The English have great power over the French. In one peradventure, at this moment, some noble colonel at this moment sinks to the ground without breath, with convulsive pangs died. It is a mandatory consideration." This statement is both aware and sensational. Away from the broad, overarching political and social commentary of war, Fleming chooses to focus on individual suffering, breaking away from considering the condition of the army en masse, and instead adopting an approach that notes the sudden impact war has on specific moments of time. It seems extraordinary in the thought processes of such a young girl, and yet somewhat detached from adult bias and political agency. Fleming's age perhaps allows a stripping back of the complexities of war and a deeper connection with the rawer elements of human feeling and experience. Much like Charlotte, her status as a girl, writing privately to explore current themes and feelings, allows a freedom of expression, offering an opportunity for adult states to be understood and deconstructed. And I absolutely adore the fact that she writes "at this moment," both repeating that again and again in her diary, which shows that she's completely focused on that present moment and the feelings and sensation of war in that one moment of time. At this moment, some noble colonel at this moment sinks to the ground. So other young writers were more patriotic. The poet Felicia Hemans, known for her poem Casabianca, or The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck, which I know that multiple people studied in school. So Hemans published a collection of poems in age 14 in 1808. Her two brothers entered the Napoleonic Wars, and Hemans was caught up in the patriotism surrounding it. In her poem titled "To My Younger Brother on His Entering the Army," she writes, "Though we are now resigned to grief, it may be thine to bring relief. Oh, let us see thy patriot name recorded in the lists of fame, and then our hearts with joy sincere will bless our noble Fusilier." Although this is evidently blindly celebratory in nature, it is still tinged with grief and the same essence of feeling that is typical in young persons' reactions. Hemans is one of the few children given a platform to publish in the Romantic period. Yet, much like girls who receive public attention today in war, her views were treated with suspicion. Her poems were harshly critiqued, deemed too flowery, patriotic, and a trap of cultural contradiction. Hemans was denied authenticity, and her childlike voice thought of as superficial and decorative. I would say, however, that this imitation is important in itself, showing another important component of youthful observation. Unlike Fleming and Browning and Brontë, who do bring a sense of authenticity to wartime experience in their private writings, Hemans collects the social feeling of the age and regurgitates it in her own writings, showing how impactful patriotism is and how it reverberates down the ladder of youth until it imprints its doctrines on the next generation. In short, children's position as consumers trains them to produce outputs that perpetuate myths and ideologies that, in turn, frighten or the adult generation find them uncanny and frightening. And they're the ones that have instilled them in the first place. So it's a cycle. It's cyclical. This bank of examples solely shows the range and depth of girlhood war writing around the Napoleonic Wars, yet as we move through the century, more examples of girls as both fighters and war writers emphasise that girls' militarism was not isolated to European wars, but global conflicts. Throughout the 19th century, Britain's fixation on empire and expansion resulted in numerous colonial conflicts. One such conflict was the Indian Uprising of 1857, which saw countrywide rebellion against its sovereign power, the British East India Company. In a bid for independence, the uprisings lasted between 1857 to 58, with citizens very much caught in the crossfires of combat. A number of material artefacts place women and girls at the centre of the action. This baby's bonnet was found down a well in Cawnpore, the location of a massacre in 1857. As news of violence across northern India reached the town, 375 women and children and 200 soldiers barricaded themselves behind makeshift defences. They were falsely offered safe passage down a river, which resulted in an ambush. 125, mainly women and children, survived and were incarcerated in a British bungalow to be used as in a potential hostage negotiation. This moment in history was immortalised by Sir Joseph Noel Paton's painting In Memoriam, which puts women and young girls at the centre of a sentimentalised scene, emphasising their piety and innocence. In the end, however, there were no negotiations and all women and children were massacred and thrown down a well. This bonnet, belonging to one of the girls, was recovered and donated to Cheshire Regiment Museum, standing as a poignant reminder that girls are exposed to and part of brutal global conflicts. In this uprising, however, it is clear that some women and children had agency. Although few accounts from youth survived the event, a reflective memoir written by Esper Betts, who was 17 at the time of the uprising, survives and is housed in the National Army Museum. She writes about her and her family's escape from Gorakhpur in 1857, describing their panicked and erratic journeys and the family's return to their home after the mutiny, hearing from their servants that the Saurs, which are members of the Indian Cavalry Regiment, surrounded the house. Thinking we were easy prey to their ferocity, when finding we'd escaped, they destroyed the furniture and demanded the surrender of government treasure. Betts's memoir is detailed and committed in both its factual events and current prejudices. She talks about handling of a revolver and the trust her father had in keeping her up to date with present dangers. She also, however, adds imaginative flair to her story, describing her father building a primitive wagon to travel with, envisaging their trip like Noah's Ark. Therefore, this account feels different to more traditional army reports. It combines storytelling with historical detail, providing a fresh and insightful new way of accessing military history. Yet it is not just European narratives that attest to girls' presence and importance in constructing a narrative of women's agency during the uprising. From the fighting side of India, a number of women were combatants, joining a long list of Indian fighting women, mostly queens, who had been involved in civil and colonial combat. Begum Hazrat Mahal seized control of Lucknow, declaring her son as ruler. Queen Rani of Jhansi, who massacred European officers and their families and led troops at the siege of Jhansi, and Rani Avant Bey, who was 17 at the time of the uprising. She raised and led an army of 4,000 and eventually committed suicide with her sword on the 20th of March. After independence, India remembers her in a folk song of the Gondi people, which hails her as the chief of the jungles. These women show a military agency that highlights the cultural differences between European and Indian girlhoods, with women in Indian society given military mobility, not often openly offered to European women in the 19th century. I have yet to come across written accounts offered by the Indian side, but would welcome any suggestions, either in the questions or please feel free to email me. The same can be said for the Second Anglo-Afghan War, another colonial conflict that is rich in European girlhood content. Fought between Britain and Afghanistan, the war began by Lord Lytton, the British governor of India, attempting to intercept the growing Russian influence in Afghanistan by invading the country. One such soldier on the British side was General Sir Stanley de Burgh Edwards, who acted as Chief Director of Transport for the duration of the war. His daughters, Ida and Sybil, both 10 and 11, remained in a boarding school in England, whilst their mother joined him. 99 letters of theirs survive, housed in the National Army Museum, that show the girls' interaction with them throughout the course of the war, which lasted for 2 years. They're an interesting read, showing a sense of responsibility on the siblings' part to recreate visual images of home life, be that a fireworks display, a local dance, or coloured cloth bought for a new dress. The siblings, however, also understood the complexities that come from being at war, complaining about how they rarely hear from their father, but knowing his duty is first and foremost to his country. Their letters also show how deeply involved they were in his military world, keeping up with military affairs, arranging networking opportunities, and keeping their father informed of military society back home. For example, in one letter, Ida writes, "Do you know, father, a gentleman called Gen or Colonel Bying? He commands the 6th Madras. He has just been ordered down to Burma." Although both girls are not present on the front line, their status as military children blurs the boundaries between war zones and the domestic space, demonstrating a different kind of agency in youth that is concerned with administrative duties and knowing the importance of being both supportive and entertaining. Much like the Indian uprising, the prevailing girlhood identity on the native side of war is that of the warrior. Although, unfortunately, I've yet to come across first-hand accounts of Afghani women and girls' experiences of war, the particular legacy of one 18-year-old warrior has gone on to become a symbol of strength and female empowerment in Afghani culture. Malalia of Maiwand was 18 when she fought and died at the Battle of Maiwand, responsible for the Afghan victory over the British. The folk story is that, when the army was losing its morale, Malalia took up the flag and shouted, "If you do not fall in the Battle of Maiwand, by God, someone is saving you," as a symbol of shame. Her efforts and sacrifice have solidified her status as an Afghani Joan of Arc, and her story is still taught to children through school textbooks today. In fact, her name and power she embodies has been brought into Western knowledge through the famous Pakistani child activist Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by the Taliban and now campaigns for female educational rights. In her autobiography, I Am Malala, she writes that she is named after Malalia. She writes of her importance in South Asian culture, with hospitals and schools named after her, yet the problematic erasure of her in the Western consciousness. She writes, "Not surprisingly, she does not appear anywhere in the fastidious archives of the British. While a Malalia of Maiwand is a historical figure, her story reminds us of the fact that the erasure of strong, politically active Afghan women who attempted to resist the status quo is not unique to imperial discourse. This erasure was a key tool that British colonial forces used in order to make the case that Afghanistan was a backward country whose women were oppressed and, more significantly, did not have the tools to liberate themselves." As is clear from the Wars of Empire in this paper, voices of girlhood are very difficult to come by even from a colonial perspective, so attempting to recover even further marginalised voices is a challenge, but one that must be attempted. It is refreshing to see Maiwand's agency in war celebrated and memorialised through a girl's voice today, her historic agency and rebellion captured and used as a political critique for war. Yet there is more work to be done in order to find authentic voices in military history that truly represent the global struggles of war outside a Eurocentric, westernised vision. I would be delighted to see the words, if preserved, of these women warriors or witnesses integrated within white histories, and alongside uncovering the silenced voice of youth in a general sense, uncover more indigenous voices that undo the problematic one-sided narrative of westernisation. Then, only then, a true all-round picture of girls' agency in war can be painted. To conclude this talk, and the papers as a whole today, all show that authoritative accounts of women's military history exist, and each should be inserted into the mainstream canon of interdisciplinary war studies. The girls in this paper range from combatants to witnesses, fictional war writers to voices of protest. Their experiences are valid, their agency is clear. It is time to dismantle the structures that keep women's historical accounts of war as othered or novel, and open both male and Western spaces to reflect gender fluid and globally representative accounts. Moreover, the same can be said for youthful accounts. Children have been and are a part of war, and the suspicion and inauthenticity that we view their real-world experiences must be deconstructed. It is true that children, in this case girls, often occupy and have to navigate an adult space, but as this paper has shown, their participation and intuitive understandings of the physical and emotional toll of war makes their testimonies useful and credible sources in larger, more formal military histories. These girls deserve to be seen, and these girls deserve to be heard. Thank you very much for listening today.